My name is Brad Pauquette, and I'm the author and developer of the Novel Matrix writing system. So today I'm sitting down with my friend Thirzah, who has just released her second book. It's called A Traitor's Vow. You can find it on Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com and all those places. But I just want to sit down with her and talk to her about this book. And specifically, she used the Novel Matrix system, at least as part of her preparation process. So, Thirzah, welcome. Love to chat today.
Hi, Brad. It's great to be here.
That was a really weird intro now that I think about it. Hi, Tirza. I'd love to chat today. Like, as if you're not already here. Like,
It's like we're AI.
that's something. Yeah, right? Yeah, next time I'm going to have like 8 fingers on my hand or something.
Ooh.
But I am really glad that you're here because you came through the company with me, of course. So you spent 2 years learning under my tutelage, so to speak, right? Because how many times do you get to use the word tutelage in conversation? But while you were here, you learned the Novel Matrix system. Before the book even came out, you've been doing this for a while. And so you wrote your first book, The Librarian's Ruse, while you were here with me. Of course, we'll put a note to that in the show notes. And now you've released A Traitor's Vow, which is the second book in the same series. So just before we jump into like Novel Matrix stuff, and I just want you to kind of educate our audience on how you practically applied some of that. Before we get into that, just tell us about the book. What is A Traitor's Vow about? Who should read it?
Okay, so A Traitor's Vow is the continuation of the Adventures in Elvenair series and the continuation of my protagonist, Amelia's journey. And as for who this book is for, it is for girls between the ages of 12 and 16, 17. And yeah, I wrote this book because when I was around those ages, I had a really hard time finding books that were clean enough that my mom would be okay with me reading them, but were exciting enough that I wasn't like yawning every single time I turned the page.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you are a Christian. You are a Christian writer, and you also grew up in that homeschool environment, right? So like what you read was really really important to your parents. And what kind of stuff were you typically allowed to read? I'm just curious.
So I was allowed to read books like Melanie Dickerson, so like the fairy tale retellings. I was allowed to read books like Nancy Drew, all the mystery books, Hardy Boys. I read a lot of classics like Pride and Prejudice, and basically anything by Louisa May Alcott. Yeah, those were basically the types of books that I was allowed to read. Oh, and Little House on the Prairie, of course.
Of course, yeah, and there's some really good stuff in there, right? But I know, like my kids, who we also homeschool and are kind of in that age bracket, it's really easy to just run out of stuff, right? That's any good. And your book, I would not say it shares that much in common with Louisa May Alcott,
No.
or uh, or most of the others that you mentioned, but you do have a fair amount in common with Melanie Dickerson, like fairy tale retellings. I can definitely see
hmm
some inspiration in that. So I don't know, just talk about that. What do you love about that space, that kind of fairy tale, Regency, kind of light fantasy kind of space?
See, one of the things that I really liked about Melanie Dickerson's books is because they were such a twist on like the stories that you've heard before, or maybe you haven't heard them before. But I really liked the whole taking something that you know and then turning it around and turning it into something that is new. And that's what I wanted to do with my books. Like, I originally wrote The Librarian's Ruse, the first book in the series, to be a loose adaptation of The Emperor's New Clothes, but told in a completely new way from the point of view of the swindlers. And so that was like where I started. And then after I finished that book and I was told that I needed to write a second one, I had to go from there and I had to create something entirely different because I could no longer rely on the story that I had relied on in the past.
Oh, yeah. I didn't know that. You've never told me that before.
I didn't?
That's
Oh,
good.
wow.
Well, I think you told me the Emperor's New Clothes part. I did know that part, but
Okay.
just as far as like continuing the series, I hadn't considered that like you are kind of like all on your own. You're kind of dangling by a thread at that point, right?
Yeah.
And for those that don't know, Melanie Dickerson does these fairy tale retellings, and in fact, is probably like a year, like most of the way through your first year. I was like, Tirza, give me a book of what you want to be able to write. You remember that?
I do remember that.
Yeah, because I could tell, you had a really specific target, and I just want to before I like told you what to do, I want to make sure I understood the target. And you gave me a Melanie Dickerson book. I don't remember what it was called. Do you remember? It was Beauty
I
and the Beast,
Yeah, it
basically.
was the merchant's daughter, I believe.
Oh, that's it. Yeah, The Merchant's Daughter. And so it's Beauty and the Beast, effectively, except there's no monster, there's no magic, really. Like he's
Hmm.
just like a regular guy who is kind of like been shunned by society or something like that.
Right.
So it had the same themes and story components, but without the magical stuff from like the Disney retelling. And so I read that, and then you wrote the first draft of The Librarian's Ruse, and I read it as your mentor, and I think I was like, you nailed it. You know, based on what
Yeah.
you gave me to read and what you wrote now, you crushed it. You just absolutely hit all the same marks that Melanie Dickerson is hitting.
Yeah, that was a
And
great day for
so,
me.
yeah, that was a good day. And, based on, we just recorded another podcast for the company, which you can check out at writers.company if you want. But not quite so much the same experience with the Trader's Vow. Took a little more time to get to the final draft on that one, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. It was a little bit of a nightmare for me. Probably the lowest part of my career as an author. But hey, if that's the lowest point, then I can only go up from there, right?
It's all up from here. That's the rock bottom moment, right? And
Yeah.
speaking of rock bottom moments, thank you for the segue, Tirzah. Let's talk about the novel Matrix, since I think that's what a lot of the audience here will be interested in. So you use the novel Matrix specifically to craft the librarian's ruse, but you wrote a novella for a like a high school, middle school age girl audience. So what was that? Just talk to me about your experience. How did you apply the novel matrix? Did you do anything differently on purpose because of the type of book you were writing? Things like that. What are your thoughts?
So, just having the novel matrix was a lot different from what I would usually do because I was not really much of a planner. Like, oh, yeah, sure, I'd be like, okay, well, this is what the story's about, and I need characters, so I need to create some characters. I don't really
Yep.
know what they'll do yet, but we'll have characters and we'll throw them into a storyline and we'll see what happens. And that's what I would usually do, but usually that ends in a half finished or just partially finished draft. So doesn't really get that far. With the novel matrix, it made it a lot easier for me to like really see where I was going with this story. Like I actually had a plan, like an end goal. And having that end goal really helped me finish the story. Like I knew exactly where I needed to go and what I needed to do in order to get there. So that's what I was able to do. And as for developing characters and stuff, that was also a lot different because I would never have thought that I needed to assign roles to the characters, like figure out who they are in the story as well as just who they are as a character.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And it is different, right? And psychologically, how your readers experience the story is very different when you're just like, oh, here's some interesting people. Let's put them together and see what they do, versus like, oh, you have this job and you have this job. Kind of like if you're running a business, right? Like if you're running a pizza shop and you just throw five people in there and you're like, okay, have fun. Customers will be here in a half an hour. It's not going to go well. But if you're like tonight, you're the cook and you're going to be the delivery driver and you're going to work the front desk, then things are going to go much smoother. But so you did a lot of that work ahead of time, and of course you were young when you started the apprenticeship. You are our youngest apprentice ever. You started at 17 years old, which was very brave of you. Most of our apprentices are college age, so you weren't like way off base or way out of the ballpark or anything. But you're definitely like courageous to finish high school early and move away from home by a few hundred miles and join us. But up until that point, what had your writing been like before you got that kind of mentorship and instruction?
So before I went to the company, it was a lot harder for me to be disciplined. It was a lot harder for me to, because I wrote for fun. Like, I didn't even really think of the whole, oh, I want to be a full time author thing until like this summer I decided to go to Ohio and learn how to be a full time author. Before that, it was sort of just a fun thing that I did. It was actually part of my schoolwork as well. Like that kind of counted for my English, so it was kind of fun to be
Right.
able to just be like, oh, I get to have fun and write, and it also counts for school. Um, and so I did my best to like learn more about writing. Like I attended different workshops and different seminars and stuff like that. But for the most part, I was just on my own. I looked stuff up. I played around a lot, and that really didn't get me very far. Yeah, I have so many unfinished novel drafts in my folders that to go back and look at them, like it takes up an entire folder, like completely.
Yeah, I know, and you came in. You obviously like you're a talented writer, right? That's why we invited you into the program because we saw that potential. But things changed, and you wrote the Librarian's Ruse, and again, you just did an awesome job with that. But when you get to the second book, not only did you not have the premise that you were kind of adopting like you did with The Emperor's New Clothes, but also writing a sequel is different in some ways, right? So talk to me about how the novel matrix worked differently moving into the second book. Like I know you moved some characters around into different roles, and I would imagine kind of the shape of the plot was a little bit different as well.
Yeah, it was definitely different. I was kind of able to follow some of the same structure for the plot for the most part, just because of where I ended the first story. Like it was sort of like starting over again with like a new story. But parts of the plot did have to shift around a little bit in order for the story itself to work out properly. But as far as, yeah, characters were probably the things that changed the most because my antagonist ended up being more of a frenemy in the next
Right.
book. So that was kind of interesting for me. And the frenemy ended up being more of a sidekick. So it's interesting how that kind of shifted in the next book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to note, like a lot of people ask, how do I plan a trilogy? And my first answer is you don't. If you want to write a trilogy, the first thing you do is write one really, really good book. And you earn sequels. I think this is a big mistake that writers make is they sit down to write and before they've even started, they have like plans for a 5 book series or a 3 book trilogy or whatever. And you earn the second book, right? You write the second book because the first book was really good, which is what happened in your case. Here's like the first book, like it doesn't end with a cliffhanger, definitely going into the second book. Because you used the novel matrix and you created this big world, you do have some open doors to extend the plot and kind of explore some different areas. But you didn't write the first book just as a setup for the second book. Instead, you just wrote a really great story, and we were like, that worked. The audience seems to be connecting with it, so we got to do more with it. And so that's really important. But after that point, I often encourage people if you think about a trilogy, in the novel matrix, we talk about the 3 act structure. Each book should really perform one act of the story in addition to being its own 3 act story. So that means like the first book, again, it just has to be a really great book. But as we move into the second book, it means that we're going to start low and we're going to end low, which you accomplish with this story. In fact, you leave us with this really perilous cliffhanger. In fact, I don't think this story can get any lower. So there's almost no like dramatic rise in the 3rd act. We get a little bit of it, in order to satisfy our psychological expectations for the story. But you really leave us in that low point so that the third book now can serve the function of the 3rd act and take us from low to super high. Um, am I hitting it? Is that what you did, Tirza?
See, yeah, like most of it, like at first a lot of it was like on accident. Like I didn't, like I knew I was following the novel matrix, but I wasn't completely sure how well I was doing. And then by the end of it I was like, wait a second, this kind of actually works. And then you confirmed it for me and I was like, okay, this actually works, it actually follows the plan. Like I
Yeah.
didn't realize how well I was doing, but okay, we got it. Like it all worked out in the end. But yeah, there was a lot of I think because I changed so much about the second book, I got a little bit frazzled trying to make sure that I was still keeping up with the novel matrix. But
Right.
I was able to eventually get back on track, and it all followed the story as it was supposed to do. And as you said, it also hit the overall arc of the entire trilogy.
That's cool. Yeah. And you did something that is such a common mistake in fantasy, I'm not picking on you, but you said all doors are open for this conversation, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
So we worked together on the second book as well, even though you were out of the program, which was very cool to be able to do. But you in the first draft, you made this mistake that so many people who write fantasy make, and that is to spend way too much time having characters travel between places. Right? It's very Tolkien. Tolkien is going to take us every step of the way. He's going to describe every bush and tree and rock that we pass. For 50,000 words, he's going to transport us from one location to the other. But in modern fantasy, it just really doesn't work. It's I don't I'm gonna lose a lot of followers on this one, but I don't think it works for Tolkien either. I think we accept it because it's sort of nostalgic and it serves some other purposes in that way. But that just doesn't work for modern audiences to just have us travel. So how do you get out of that, Tirza, when you have characters and really all they're doing in this plot is just traveling from point A to point B? What's the solution?
So, what I did was I focused on what was actually important to the plot throughout the travel. So, like, what
Mhm.
conversations needed to happen? What did the characters need to learn before we could move on? So that was kind of like my focus instead of the whole let's just enjoy the journey. Let's meander along. Let's let everyone see what they're doing every single point of the way.
But wasn't there some really important foliage that you missed describing?
Yeah,
When you
I'm
cut
so
out
sad.
that stuff?
I no longer have my description of the fog rolling in. I don't have any of the rain or the earthy smell of the ground, but it's fine. It works.
Well, and in fairness, you do. It's just embedded in scenes that also serve other functions of the plot, right?
Right, I
Like,
did manage to sneak some in there.
right, for sure. Like we talk about, a scene should serve two of three purposes. It should motivate the plot, it should develop character, and it should develop themes. And any element in your book should be always be doing at least two of those three things. And so you still get to include, your favorite ferns that need to be described, but it just has to be in the context of something else that's happening, right?
Yeah, has to serve the plot.
Right. All right. So, Tirza, you are gaining experience as a writer. You're now published twice, which is super cool. I mean, in no uncertain terms, you are doing things that a lot of writers dream of. And I'm sure you still have room to grow in that. I get it. That's still, there's still goals ahead of you, and you still need to grow and build your audience and continue to build your platform and things like that. But somebody that is, further back on their journey, what's something that you would share with them? What's some piece of wisdom that has helped you to get to the things that you're doing now?
Ooh, that's a good question. So, when I first began, I was deathly afraid of failing. Like that would be like the worst thing that could possibly happen to me if I was a character in a story. Um, a failure would bring me right to rock bottom, and it would make it really hard for me to get back up. But when I did fail, like especially with the Traitor's Vow, that was a big failure for me. The first draft, I could have given up. I could have said, "Nope, we're done." That was nice. This whole writing thing was a great experiment, and now it's time to try something else. But I didn't, and maybe part of that was stubbornness. Part of that was because I know that God called me to be a writer. But at the end of the day, I knew that even though I failed, that wasn't the end of my journey. And so being able to not only fail, but decide to try to fix your failures has been something that completely changed the way that I think about writing and about my life. And so, yeah, like that's what I've learned throughout this entire process, that failure is not the end. Failure is just a breeding ground for hope, because once you fail, there's only one way to go from there, as long as you keep trying, and that's up.
I love that, Tirza, and I can confirm for listeners and watchers right now that is true. That I see that in you as well. You are not a quitter. If there's one thing you are not a quitter, and that has served you well. And so that is hard earned wisdom, and I appreciate you sharing that today. So Tirza, tell us, I really appreciate your time and just that you would share with other writers through these venues. How can people connect with you? You know, if they like you and they want to see more of your stuff, where should they go? What should they do?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me at tirzahwrites.com. And for those of you who are having trouble with the spelling, that's Thirzah writes.com. And you can also find me on Instagram. I post a lot of cool writing content there or reading content. And you can also find me on Pinterest if you are looking for inspiration. I do a lot of writing prompts on there.
Awesome, fantastic. And of course, like I said, we'll have links to books and things like that in the show notes, but also tirzahwrites.com is a great place to just find your way to whatever you're looking for. But definitely check out A Trader's Vow on Amazon or wherever you buy books. It should be available there. And one last question, Tirzah. So you are just Tirzah, right? No last
Yes.
name. You're like
No.
Cher or Prince. You know, which I think is cool, and you have such a unique name. For just, I think it's such a point of curiosity for people. Why are you just Tirza?
So I'm just Thirzah because my last name is Griffioen, which is really cool because it means griffin in Dutch. However, when you put Thirzah, which is already a hard name to spell and say with Griffioen, it just doesn't work all that well. So that's why I decided to shorten it, go with Thirzah. As much as I love the fact that my last name actually is a fantasy creature, like how perfect is that? But yeah, so for now I'm just Tirza.
Awesome, cool, and that'll be like deep knowledge for people, right? As your career grows, people are like, oh, I know the reason why she's just Tirza. So thanks for sharing that with us today. And again, thanks for being here, Tirza. For everybody watching and listening, please pick up the book, check it out, especially if you know somebody in that like 12 to 17-year-old reader range. I think it really hits the mark. And if they start with The Librarian's Ruse now and move on to A Trader's Vow, the third book should be along this winter to complete the series. So get them started on that. And if you have more questions about this Novel Matrix stuff, you can, of course, get my book, The Novel Matrix, on Amazon. Go to novelmatrix.com. There's a bunch of free stuff there, or there are classes available from the company at writers.company. So thanks for joining us today. Thanks for just catching up with us and continuing on your writing journey. So until we see you again, happy writing and be blessed.